Welcome to the latest episode of Gowling WLG's Listener Podcast, where we look at a range of topics trending in the legal and commercial landscapes.
Hello and welcome to our podcast on tariffs following Trump's recent Liberation Day and his step back from high global tariffs yesterday. Today is 10th of April. That's important for this podcast because this is a subject that is changing by the hour. My name is David Lowe. I lead our commercial contracts team. I'm an expert in international supply contracts.
I'm Bernardine Adkins, partner in the EU Competition and Trade team.
And I'm James Stunt. I'm a Senior Associate in the EU Trade and Competition team.
So we are today going to put our heads together to try and work through what this might mean from a legal perspective. We're not going to pretend to be economists and we're not political commentators. We're going to focus more on the legal perspective. But first, James, where are we? There's so much happening at the moment. Exactly as we record this podcast, what is the position?
Yes, so as you said, David, this is something that is changing on an hourly basis. So very important to note that we are recording this on the afternoon of the 10th of April, 2025 UK time. But where we stand at the moment, obviously the big news item was that on the 2nd of April, 2025, President Donald Trump issued an executive order introducing tariffs on all of the US's trading partners. For the UK, as well as for a number of other countries. This meant that imports of all UK goods were subject to an additional 10% tariff on the value of those goods. At the date of the executive order, certain other countries, including China, as well as the EU, were subject to additional tariff rates, meaning that they would be required to pay a higher rate of tariffs on import of their goods into the US. However, on the 9th of April, President Trump announced a 90-day pause on the country-specific tariffs, with the notable exception of tariffs in relation to Chinese goods. What this means is that the current 10% baseline rate will continue to apply for imports of all countries' goods into the US. But the higher country-specific rates, for example, the 20% rate applied to the EU, will not take effect for another 90 days.
Okay, and the EU was talking of retaliating and introducing tariffs, but I think they've paused on that, haven't they?
Yes, that's correct. So the EU introduced a further set of tariffs on imports of US goods into the EU, and that was at a rate of 25%. It wasn't all US goods, it was a selection of commodities. However, following the announcement by President Trump, the EU has paused its tariffs, additional tariff measures for another 90 days, so in line with the US pullback.
So remind me, James, where are we on the US-China tariffs? What's the rate on imports into the US from China?
Yes, so as we are speaking now, the rate of US goods into China is a payment of 84% tariffs on the value of those goods. For Chinese goods entering the US, it's tariff rate of 125% on those Chinese goods.
And then there's also those tariffs on steel, aluminium, cars, car parts. What was the position on that?
Yes, so the US introduced tariffs of 25% on steel and aluminium imports, as well as 25% on imports of cars and car parts. Those were introduced in March 2025. Those are still in effect, so those are not subject to the 90-day pause.
So although big moment yesterday of Trump stepping back and the stock markets therefore responded, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that actually we've now got a lot more tariffs in place than we did pre-Trump.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of talk at the moment around the tariffs having been lifted. That, of course, is not the case. From a UK perspective, we are still as we were before the 9th of April. So we're still required to pay 10% on imports of all goods into the US. And we are still subject to those tariffs on steel and aluminium, as well as automotives and automotive parts. I should also say there are some exceptions to the 10% tariff rate, including copper, lumber, but those are currently subject to investigation and being looked at by the US, so they may well be subject to tariffs at a later point.
So my reading of those US investigations into those sectors is that that's just an indicator that the US expects to introduce tariffs in those areas?
I think it's fair that we can look at those as being areas that are under consideration, and certainly if a business is active in those space, should keep an eye on the developments in case that exception no longer applies.
So assuming people listen to some mainly UK and European, probably the pharmaceuticals ones is going to be the key area of interest. Lumber's, that's probably more relevant to Canada or a bill.
Yeah.
Copper, obviously, it's global, but you don't source much copper in Europe and UK. Okay, right. So that's where we are. So Bernardine, we've got this 90-day period. I mean, we can all chill out now, can't we?
No, I think the word, the sword of Damocles, is the one that jumps to mind. So the idea seems to be there are allegedly, I think, 70 countries that have been given this stay of execution. And according to the Trump administration, they're the ones who have not already implemented their retaliatory tariffs. So the idea is that some form of deal is going to be concluded from those 70 countries. So even just having, say, 3 or 4 countries in a negotiation with even a country as large as the US, with all the resources they will have, it simply isn't doable. So the question is, what is going to happen in those 90 days? So I think, first of all, the idea of there being, what is a trade agreement? So a trade agreement, if we're still talking just about tariffs, where you offer a tariff to a country, under the WTO most favoured nation clauses, you have to offer it to everybody else in the WTO. Because otherwise, the whole concept is, otherwise you have the big countries doing each other favours and the smaller, arguably more impoverished countries being out in the cold. So that is fundamental to the proper functioning of the WTO. The only exception to that is if you do what I call a full-fat free trade agreement, where substantially all the trade is the subject of open borders, as between you. So in other words, no tariffs. So that simply isn't feasible. Or if one is being an open trade-minded person, neoliberal, saying, great, if people offer zero tariffs on, obviously not substantially all the trade to America, because they're so concerned at the level of tariffs that they're becoming their way, they have to offer that to everybody else. So this could be paradise for open trade people. But I don't think that's going to happen. So what will we see instead? So I think what we'll see instead is quite a mishmash. I think will be a huge variety of possibilities. And it's interesting also, we see already the UK is nuancing. It's no longer talking about a trade deal. It's talking about an economic deal. So they're looking at things, cooperation on AI and tech. And arguably, a trip in the gold carriage on a state visit is arguably part of that whole deal. And so other countries will offer different things that they feel that may make a difference. So I can't help wondering whether we aren't going to be seeing a little bit of kabuki theatre right now. And I think we saw a little bit of that the last time in Trump won, when the president of the commission came over, personally sat with President Trump and said, yes, we will buy natural gas from you, and also we'll buy more soybeans. So there wasn't, and yes, we'll all have discussions and talks to go to zero tariffs. Very nice idea. But the purchase of soybeans was not in John-Claude's control, yet that was deemed satisfactory. So I can't help wondering, as I say, we'll see a little bit of performance economic deals in the next 90 days, and everybody can save face.
Which would be consistent with many of the things President Trump has done, hasn't it? Their performance and appearance is often so crucial.
Which would be nice, because even if one was to say, OK, they'll do enough now to delay the stay of those tariffs, although taking off that 10% would be good. But there's a limit to how much more free trade, how far people can cut into the bone of cutting back on tariffs, because we've already had, people don't realise, we've already had decades of pushing and liberalising. We've had the Uruguay round, the Doha rounds, which pushed back and back and back on these tariffs. So where we still have tariffs, it's in relation to those products, which necessarily it is imperative for a country to keep an indigenous industry. Agriculture being the opposite one, because heaven forbid in cases of times of war, or as we saw in times of pandemics, you need to be able to grow your own food. Iron and steel, we're seeing that example now where, notwithstanding how much it may cost the UK, we are seriously looking at privatisation, because it's imperative we have something of an iron and steel industry, irrespective of whether it's loss-making or not, because if you need to build an army in a hurry, you need some iron and steel. So how far so much has been paid back and back and back. So there's a limit to how far into the bone people can cut on these tariffs. So I think we're going to see an awful lot of creativity emerging in these 90 days, and perhaps a little bit of eccentricity in terms of what we regard as a quote-unquote trade/economic deal.
You touched on the WTO stuff because you said because of the WTO stuff, people can't simply say, tell you what, America will give 0% on soybeans if in return you give us 0% on wine, and doing some... That's what President Trump thinks like, isn't it? He'll just think of it as a trade. But I think what you're saying is that's difficult to do within the WTO framework.
Exactly, within the framework of the WTO, yes.
But where is the WTO now? I mean, is it relevant in this discussion? Has it become... Is it going to survive? Because the US has starved it, hasn't it? I mean, is it an effective organisation and people have maybe just ignore it?
Yeah, it has failed to they've not been able to reappoint the top end of the appellate bodies. But what has happened, because the WTO makes sense. You know, it has given us global prosperity, complex supply chains, and people don't want those ruptures. So what has happened on the side, a number of states, including the UK, Europe, Canada, China, but not the US, they have their side deal, so to speak, of arbitration. So where there's a will, there's always a way in this sort of thing. So America, okay, is not playing because it felt that the appellate body was far too much about precedent setting, decision setting, whereas America, where it's at in terms of its economic power, possibly a little how Britain was a few hundred years ago, saying, well, might is right. I don't want to be subject to, you know, some form of jurisprudence or, you know, a tale of decisions. I want things to be made on their merits at that time. So it was not pleased. This is not just what this administration or the previous Trump administration did. This is consistent US policy. They don't like that appellate system and they're not playing with it. But it absolutely does not mean that the WTO is broken by any stretch of the imagination.
And certain other countries don't seem to be treating it as such. We've already seen China almost immediately after the introduction of the tariffs launched a complaint in the WTO. So other countries are willing and prepared to use the WTO system. And as you say, Bernardine, there are ways of navigating the WTO, notwithstanding the issues it currently faces.
So the US might not care about the WTO, but because everybody else is trading with everybody else, they will care about the WTO. So they'll be bearing that in mind in their US deals, what it might mean under the WTO framework.
Absolutely.
Is what you're saying.
Absolutely, yes.
And therefore, you don't think we're just going to see nice, simple deals,
no.
soybeans versus wine or whatever.
No.
And that therefore takes you to that creative, performative area that you described.
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. James, I'm conscious that the UK government, although no doubt hoping to keep its cool head and to see this through and hopefully do some kind of deal with the US, it's launched a consultation about tariffs. Tell me about that and what could corporates be doing in response to that?
Yeah, so I think we have this 90-day period. As I said earlier, for the UK, that makes limited impact. But I think it's a mistake to think that countries will be sitting on their hands during that period. We saw the UK government launch a consultation, this was on 3rd of April, in relation to possible tariffs that the UK might implement in respect of US goods entering the UK. The UK government has stressed it's looking for views from businesses for all imports of US goods, so real range there. But it has also published what it's calling an indicative list of products on which it is more likely to impose tariffs. We obviously don't know the potential rates or indeed how much, if any, of those goods will be subject to tariffs. But the government is exploring its options. And so if businesses are engaged in imports from the US or indeed consuming US goods, then it is imperative that they examine the consultation and consider submitting responses if they consider that their business, their customers, or indeed the UK economy as a whole might be affected by any measures that the UK introduces. Having a say when government is clearly looking for a say is really quite important.
And presumably, if you're a UK company that would benefit from restrictions on US imports, this would also be a good time to make that point.
Absolutely, yes. The government has made it very clear its preference is to negotiate an agreement, but businesses' views, the impact on the economy is really high on their considerations. So having an impact in this way is vital.
So there'll be in-house lawyers listening to this. I mean, obviously, massive commercial issues washing around, which we'll come on to, but that's probably something, if I was an in-house lawyer in-house, that would be saying, hey, what are we doing about this consultation? Is this relevant to us? Should you respond? That would be a really good action to take, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
David, can I flip it back a bit? Because you've been doing all the questioning. We've been doing all the work, so to speak. Is in terms of, because you're, at the coalface in terms of these complex supply agreements, what do you think in this interim period should be of concern to people, and what can they do?
Yeah, of course, the contracts are really important, and the delivery point and the responsibility for import and export duties are obviously crucial in any contract. And so obviously people will be looking at those contracts, particularly starting with the customer contract. I'm selling goods to a customer cross-border. Who between me and customer is responsible for export and import duties? And if those duties change, who's going to pick up the tab? Those people who are with UK businesses will have gone through all this with Brexit, so actually should be in quite good shape on that very basic issue of what Incoterm have I used and what does it mean. Very basically, the only Incoterm where the seller pays for import is DDP, delivered duty paid. So if you're a seller and you've used any other Incoterm, it's the buyer's problem. But it doesn't just start there, because obviously tariffs impact your supply chain. And I think that's the harder issue. It's obvious if tariffs are going to impact you on your sale delivery point, but what about the huge supply chain behind you? What about the 10,000 components that go into a vehicle? They may be coming up your supply chain, increasing the cost of your supply chain, meaning the cost of your product is going up. So obviously understanding what your contracts say, if the cost goes up, is really, really important. Now, if you've got a short-term contract and the price is only fixed order by order, then you may have commercial issues, but legally you've got no issue of changing your prices. But if you're in a long-term contract, then the change mechanism in the contract is going to be really important. And if you haven't got one, that's going to be a really hard place to be. Now, there is some speculation about whether the massive changes in tariffs could be a force majeure, and in an English law contract, force majeure will depend on exactly what the contract says. Every contract is slightly different. But as a broad rule of thumb, increases in tariffs isn't going to be a force majeure event, so it's unlikely to help you. Some contracts have material adverse effect clauses, pretty rare in English law agreements, more common in European continental agreements. But if there is one, yes, maybe this is a material adverse effect. The real thing will be some kind of change mechanism. If so, and certainly that's what I'm seeing clients talking to me about now, is introducing to their contracts change mechanisms so that if their costs go up, in particular tariff costs go up, that they can seek a renegotiation. I think obviously also people will be looking, well, where's my supply chain impacted? We've obviously got the 10% tariff globally, so that's everywhere. But obviously if your supply chain's touching China and ultimately your goods are going to the US, you'll be trying to work that through. And if I was prioritizing, I'll be going, where does my supply chain touch China and where does it touch US? Because that's the really explosive bit to all of this.
And then there's the question, where do I want to divert it? And where can I benefit from trade agreements, tariff-free trading? And the question we're being asked quite a bit now, James, aren't we, about is what is this thing about origin of goods? Do you want to explain that as best you can? It's complex in a nutshell, please, James.
Yes, as best I can for what is a complex topic. Unfortunately, this is a topic that does differ depending on where you're looking, what jurisdiction you're looking in, and what agreement you're making use of. But in general, for the purposes of free trade agreements, businesses can benefit from tariff-free trade in their goods if their goods can be demonstrably, or their goods can be shown to have originated in one of the parties to the trade agreements. There's a couple of ways that goods can be deemed to originate in one of those countries. The most obvious one is they are wholly produced. So if you're dealing with raw materials, if they are extracted or taken from one of those countries, that will clearly be a good that originates in that country. We obviously operate in a world where we have complex supply chains, advanced manufacturing that incorporates components from here, then, and everywhere. And that's where you start looking at more product-specific rules of origin to determine whether those goods have undergone final processing in one of those countries. This is a very product specific exercise in determining whether your goods originate. You need to understand what the commodity codes of your goods are. You need to understand where various components come from, and also a full understanding of what exactly is taking place in respect of your products in the country that you're dealing with. For example, if you're importing all of your products into the UK, they're finished goods, and you effectively just package, store them, maintain them, and then ship them somewhere else, that's not going to constitute a good originating in the UK. So this is a very intensive exercise. There's a lot of a deep understanding, but the benefit of the cost benefits for doing that analysis and getting that understanding of what your supply chain looks like can bear dividends in avoiding those potentially very significant tariffs on your imports.
So basically, and I realise it all depends on the particular product and commodity codes, but you look at where was the finished product manufactured, and then where did the components come for it?
Yes.
And then you've got to then look at all the rules to then work out how that comes together to work out what the origin of the product is.
Yes.
So if the raw material, let's say it's a piece of industrial equipment that I have actually manufactured in the UK with a larger European supply chain of components, but those components in turn have, say, used raw materials from China, then it's probably not going to be originating in China, depending on everything.
Yes.
Roughly.
Yes. So I think what you would be looking at is how much of your product comprises Chinese originating goods. So there are certain quantities for certain goods. There are certain quantities that are allowed. There are thresholds that apply. But also there is there's addition to the content that we're looking at, it's also what processes are undertaken in the UK. So you say it's manufactured in the UK. Is it just assembled in the UK, or is there a proper manufacturing operation that takes place there? And these are those kind of very granular questions that you need to grapple with in order to understand exactly what is happening and whether you can benefit from the preferential trade.
And given I said the explosive one is where China and US touch, you need to be checked. I mean, if you've got Chinese components and ultimately you're selling to the US, then you're going to be looking very, very carefully at that.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't just think you can ship them to Thailand, screwdriver them together and say it's a Thai product. So the anti-circumvention measures in place.
And it's worth pointing out as well that we're talking about this in the language of free trade agreements, but obviously you're also looking at this question when determining whether your imports to the US are subject to tariffs. So there is an exercise in understanding, are my goods of Chinese origin when I'm sending them from the UK to the US? Because you may be looking at, a shipment from UK to US, but based on the US understanding of the origin of those goods, they may be deemed to be Chinese goods. So it's a very complex, tricky question.
And if you were US customs, something that was coming from Vietnam or Cambodia, you're going to look in quite carefully at to see, actually, was it really made there? Is it just simply assembled from Chinese components that have been shipped to Vietnam? Because there's a big rise in that Vietnam trade, isn't there?
This is a perennial thing. We say to customers, know your supply chain, but right now it's more important than ever that there isn't something coming from a particular jurisdiction. Actually, truly, its origin is elsewhere. And then you're suddenly hit with an unpleasant bill at the US border or elsewhere for that matter.
And I think a related issue is just a general and boring issue of customs compliance, isn't it? For me, one of the curiosities that have come out of this last week was the stuff about the Norfolk Islands off the coast of Australia. Did you see that, about how it was clobbered with a massive tariff from the US because it had imported to the US much more than it exported much more to the US than it had imported. But the key trade that would driven the export to the US was some equipment that had been sent from Norfolk, UK. But it had been put on the customs form as Norfolk Islands off the coast of Australia. Now, that kind of stuff in a zero tariff environment doesn't really matter, does it? But in this environment, suddenly those kind of mistakes can have a huge impact, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely, and a huge bill.
So, I think that's the other thing is, I think for corporates is they should be going, what are we doing about customs compliance? How confident are we? It's more important to get it right, because I think it's a fairly dusty, boring area until now, and now it's suddenly going to become really important.
And in understanding who's responsible, whose responsibility is it to ensure that customs compliance is checked, and that goes to the points that you were discussing earlier.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, because my observation is most people think their logistics provider or customs agent is responsible. What do you think that, James? Is that right?
Well, no, it's a responsibility on you as the exporter to that goes to the point around the Incoterms you were discussing. But it is, unfortunately, as you said, a dusty subject that businesses now need to grapple with more so than arguably they have before.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. The export of record is liable, even if it outsourced it to a customs agent. And if you go and look in your customs agency agreement, it'll make that really clear. And the liability of the customs agent will be really low. And so, yeah, it's a really important part of it. The other thing I wanted to touch on, which is relevant on the here and now, is currency, because we were talking about tariffs, but the impact of tariffs has been changes in the currency markets. The Chinese currency is weakening, and it looks like they're actively weakening it. So allegedly, yeah, it appears to me, my opinion and judgment, but who knows what is actually happening is it's weakening, which is, I'm sure, the opposite of what the US want to achieve. But obviously that's relevant in a contract.
Because it neutralises the effect of the tariffs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so you need to be conscious of what currencies you contract in, because that might make an impact as to how bad or good it might be. And I think that's not being talked about enough, because that's important, obviously, for corporates who will have made judgments on currency and hedged currencies in certain ways, and that might not be appropriate. Okay, I think that's enough here and now. What about beyond that? So what's the medium term, James?
So this is an element of horizon scanning, but I think there are areas of possible concern, but also potential benefits going forward for businesses if they're trying to navigate these changes. I'll start with the bad, perhaps. So one area that we might see an increase in measures and off the back of that, increased burdens of compliance is export controls. We have seen that China introduced additional export controls following the US tariff increases. And those export controls target particularly critical minerals. Export controls are an area of contention between the US and China. Both jurisdictions have been ramping up on those areas. But these export controls specifically look to be targeting minerals that are critical for the defense sector. And so obviously an area of strategic interest for the US. What does that mean for businesses as a whole? Well, it's crucial to understand that export controls are not a trade sanction. They don't apply just to the US, they apply globally. And as we've been discussing, businesses may have supply chains that touch upon China and may touch upon products that are subject to export controls. So as we see a proliferation in export control measures from US and from China, and indeed from elsewhere, businesses may find themselves caught out by changes in the regulations if they export products from China or from other jurisdictions without obtaining proper authorization. I think another area that we might see changes, potentially adverse changes, is as certain jurisdictions may become less viable to trade with. For example, if the higher tariff rates mean that the US becomes a less attractive market, we may see a surge in imports from those countries that are targeted by higher tariff rates into other countries like the UK, like the EU. And this may have an adverse impact on domestic industries. In the UK, we have an authority called the Trade Remedies Authority, and that authority investigates whether it needs to take safeguarding measures to protect domestic industries. These measures can take a number of forms, but can include additional tariffs that are payable on those types of goods, but also tariff rate quotas, which means that it will allow for a certain quantity of goods to be imported into the UK, and above that, higher tariffs will apply. The UK government has announced that the Trade Remedies Authority is currently looking at what measures the UK has in place at the moment, particularly in relation to steel. And it is currently working with industry to assess the impacts of the potential impacts on the UK market and UK industry. But it's important for businesses to know that they can approach the Trade Remedies Authority, requesting that it initiates an investigation if it considers that this surge in impacts or potential surge in impacts is likely to have an adverse effect on their industries, on their markets. So it's just an area to be aware of, that these longer term impacts as we see supply chains shifting and demand shifting off the back of the tariff measures.
And what about the European anti-coercion thing? What is it?
Yeah, it's the new toy. They've yet to use it. So they've created this monster, but they're not loath to use it at the moment.
Yeah, so the anti-coercion instrument entered into force in 2023. As Bernardine said, it's not yet been used, but there's a lot of talk about whether it will use it. And what this instrument does is to implement measures in response to economic coercion by a third party on the EU. So the question is the US engaged in economic coercion? If, following an investigation, the EU considers that it is appropriate to use the anti-coercion instruments, the options available to it are numerous. So it can introduce additional restrictions, including tariffs, but crucially not just tariffs. It can impose restrictions on trade and services. It can introduce export controls. It can have restrictions on foreign investment, blocking participation in public procurement, and also take measures relating to trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. So there are a broad range of measures. I think the question is, will we get to a situation where the EU will use it? At the moment, it's unlikely, but it's very much a watch this space.
The world is certainly going to be getting to be a much more complex and unpredictable place. And I think that's one of the key takeaways for corporates, which is unwelcome, really, because trade
no one likes uncertainty.
Prosperity thrives in certainty, doesn't it? The other thought that occurs to me, that's particularly those people who are in-house lawyers and compliance, is that all of this is just going to feed the risk of corruption. It's going to be much more tempting, isn't it? Bribe the person at the Chamber of Commerce to certify the origin of something, bribe the US customs official to wave something through. I'd be worried. It's just the return on the corruption is now increased. It's now going to be much more tempting. So that's certainly something I think major corporates should be keeping an eye out for.
Yeah. Looking at it more positively, though, people crave certainty. So you can see America and arguably possibly China being more isolated. So what have we got? What's left on the table? And something that I think is largely underexplored is the Axis team, for example, Canada and the EU and the UK, because we do have CETA, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which the EU concluded with Canada, and it really is a gold standard free trade agreement. The UK flipped it over. So, and there's a lot in that which is not yet really come into play, because before all this tariff debacle kicked off, the whole tariff discussion was pretty over. And really what mattered in terms of encouraging trade was actually alignment of regulatory standards, getting rid of the TBTs, technical barriers to trade. So if I produce, I don't know, a mobile according to a certain set of standards, a UK set of standards, and there's a different French one, I can't sell my UK mobile in the French market, which is why these things are made according to global standards nowadays, which means this thing can be freely imported from across the globe, frankly. So the real power, I think, the really interesting trading blocks are going to be those who align their standards. And obviously we are, notwithstanding Brexit, we're in a pretty good position because our standards are, for the time being, aligned with those of the EU. And there's an awful lot of committees and talking as between Canada and the EU. But if I think if people really want to start to give this, create more certainty, there should be more and more work focusing on that alignment of regulatory standards. And there's got to, a school of thought around, the Brussels effect is the big book on it, how Brussels is creeping around, its regulatory standards are creeping around the globe. But it does facilitate trade if people align on their health and technical regulatory standards. It means that people are more open to trade with one another. And it's not just about the tariffs, which, as I said, up until a few months ago was a bit of a redundant discussion. Yeah,
the rest of the world is a big place.
Yeah,
there's plenty to play for there.
Absolutely.
And that certainly feels like the opportunity, doesn't it? And
in many ways, I think we should not be too distracted by what's going on in the US, but focus on, okay, that is what it is. It will be what it will. It's a pretty feeble situation. Where can we get certainty and reliable allies that we can be certain of, and where business will be comfortable and confident to invest?
And I think we're seeing at the moment an increased, certainly political interest in seeking those increased cooperation. So the UK, as you mentioned, Bernardine, it had that free trade agreement with Canada that was largely rolled over from CETA. There were talks about reinvigorating it, re-energizing it, and updating it, which had largely fallen away. But we've recently seen statements by Canada and by the UK to seeking again to reopen those discussions. So thinking about where, both from a political perspective, but also from what businesses can be looking at, engagement with government and getting before government and talking about the benefits that can be unlocked from those trade agreements is quite important.
Absolutely. But I think for the UK and Canada, the real prize is to have a triangulation, because the moment those are two separate free trade agreements is where you have recognition of origin as between all three. But Brexit, I'm afraid the UK was not able to negotiate that. But that is something in terms of, hopefully we're on a different place. We can try and negotiate that and allow triangulation as between these free trade agreements that we have with Canada that we have flipped over. But that may be a hard ask. I don't know.
But having the adversity and the difficulty of the situation means hopefully we can drop those barriers between people who've got things aligned, haven't they? I mean, there's also been something in the press, hasn't there, about the UK-India free trade agreement getting back on the agenda. I mean,
sorry, I just despair. It is not realistic. India is a great, marvellous, complex place. It has a lot to work, in my view. There's a lot of work it needs to do in terms of protection of intellectual property standards, etc. There's a huge amount to be said for India. But it's a massive, massive, great, complex economy. And the idea that we would completely open out our borders to trade is like, no, I don't think we can do it.
Perhaps this is going to be the subject of a future podcast where we can discuss the potential Indian-UK free trade agreement, or indeed elsewhere. I think we call that a close now. Probably during the course of recording this podcast, Trump has made another announcement and changed the world again. I hope not. But if so, we'll be back with an update. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining Gowling WLG for this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at gowlingwlg.com for more useful insights and resources. And don't forget to subscribe to ensure you join us for our next episode.